All right, good afternoon. It's good to see you all here. Thank you for joining us. My name is Noora Lori. I'm an associate professor of international relations here at the Pardee School. I'm excited to be here for this event because I'm on leave this year, so not coming to campus very often, but this is something to celebrate. And I'm very excited that today we have Professor Osman Balkan, who's going to be talking about his book, Dying Abroad, The Political Afterlives of Migration in Europe. And this is part of a longer series that is being set up by the Center for the Study of Europe on decentralizing Europe. And I can't think of a better speaker because his work really thinks about the transnational connections between different regions. And he's done work on the relationship between Middle East and Europe, and migration is one of these pathways that we can see these interregional connections. So to give a little bit about his background, Professor Balkan is the Associate Director and Program Director of Curriculum, Experiential Learning, and Innovation at the Huntsman Program in International Studies and Business at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and a senior fellow at the Lauder Institute for Management and International Studies. Other than this fantastic book that he's going to be talking about, his research and teaching focus on the politics of global migration, race and ethnicity, identity and inequality, political violence, and collective memory with a transregional concentration on Western Europe and the Middle East. He's published lots of articles in comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, studies in ethnicity and nationalism, theory and event, among many others. He is also the co-founder of the American Political Science Association's Political Ethnography Working Group, and has been doing really interesting things methodologically in addition to substantively. So I hope, we're very delighted to have you here, and I look forward to the talk and questions from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Noora, for that very warm introduction. It's an honor to be here. It's been many years since I've been at BU, and the last time was at a workshop convened by Tim and Jeremy. That was pre-COVID, so it feels like it was a lifetime ago. So I'm happy to be back, and thank you all for coming out, especially the journalism students who I had a chance to talk to over the weekend. So, as Noora mentioned, I've published a book recently called Dying Abroad, The Political Afterlives of Migration in Europe. It's part of a series by Cambridge University Press that's called the LSE International Studies Series. It's a series that prioritizes transdisciplinary approaches to international and transnational politics. And I'm happy to present the book today. And once again, thank you to Noora, to Kaya, and to Elizabeth Cohen for inviting me, and to the Center for the Study of Europe for facilitating my visit. So I'm just going to give you an overview of the book today, and I'll be happy to delve into any specific aspect that might be of interest, and to take your questions at the end. But if there's anything that's unclear, feel free to raise your hand and interrupt me too, that's fine. Dying Abroad offers an ethnographic account of the complexities of death, dying, and burial in migratory settings, and analyzes the role that end-of-life practices play in the negotiation of social, political, and cultural boundaries. My primary focus in the book is on Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent in Germany, whose posthumous predicaments resonate with other minoritized communities in Western Europe and beyond. In spite of the great diversity of migratory origins, trajectories, and destinations, there are important commonalities in the experience of what I call death out of place, that speak to the ambivalent nature of home and belonging in an increasingly globalized world. And with the term death out of place, I'm trying to capture something that is shared by immigrant and minority families confronting difficult end-of-life decisions in countries where they face structural barriers to political inclusion and equal social standing. As I hope to show today, how families navigate this complicated terrain offers insight into the stakes of membership in national and political communities, the scope of sovereign power and authority, and the antinomies of citizenship and identity in contemporary multicultural societies. Now, some of you may remember the complications of death and dying in the context of international migration became the subject of many newspaper headlines during the early months of the pandemic, as governments across the world imposed lockdowns and border closures to mitigate the spread of the virus. Numerous states enacted travel restrictions on both the living and the dead, suspending cross-border travel as well as the cross-border repatriation of human remains. These decisions left many families in distress, especially those who were unable to carry out a family member's dying wish to be buried in ancestral soils. The newspaper headlines also drew attention to the severe shortage of burial grounds for religious minorities in countries of settlement. So in France, for example, a country with 6 million Muslims, less than 2% of its 35,000 municipal burial grounds have spaces dedicated for Islamic burials. In Germany, my focus, this number is less than 1%. And although although these stories may have given the impression that the burial dilemmas were a product of the pandemic, the issues they spoke to were in fact long-standing concerns for minority communities. Perennial questions about the meaning of home and homeland take on a particular gravitas in death, especially for immigrants and their children. Moreover, the question of what is to be done with a loved one's mortal remains assumes greater urgency when cultural or religious traditions prohibit cremation and mandate burial in perpetuity. In other words, when bodies are expected to remain intact and in one place. The act of burial confers a sense of fixity to identities that are more fluid or ambivalent in life. It is a means to assert belonging, attachment, and perhaps even loyalty to a particular community, country, or place. And when the boundaries of the nation and its members are contested, burial decisions are political acts. But such decisions unfold within a myriad of overlapping and sometimes conflicting political institutions and cultural value systems. They involve a range of formal actors and informal networks. And my book starts from the premise that death and the rituals surrounding it provide an important window into the socio-economic and political orders and hierarchies that structure human life in the 21st century. I argue in the book that states, families, and religious communities all have a vested interest in the fate of dead bodies, including where and how they are buried and commemorated. Further, I show that end-of-life practices are connected to broader political struggles over the boundaries of nation-states and the place of minoritized groups within them. So local burial in countries of settlement offers a symbolically powerful means for migrants and their children to assert political membership and to foster a sense of belonging. But the widespread practice of posthumous repatriation for burial in ancestral soils illustrates the continued importance of transnational ties and serves as an indictment of exclusionary socio-political orders. And in both situations, the corpse is central to localizing and grounding political claims for recognition. And at times, this can be a highly contentious process where different actors clash over where dead bodies should go and what they might signify. Those who face death out of place, those who experience death out of place may face barriers to belonging in both the countries where they live and in those where they are purportedly from. How they attempt to resolve these contradictions in both life and in death reveals both the profound importance and the fundamental ambiguity of the meaning of home and homeland for transnational migrants and their kin. Now, this ambiguity is reflected in my own usage of the qualified and admittedly awkward phrase Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent in Germany to describe my interlocutors. And while it would be misleading to characterize these communities as immigrants, given that several generational cohorts were born in Germany and hold German citizenship, like other minoritized and racialized populations, such as the descendants of Caribbean and South Asian migrants in Britain or North Africans in France, Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent in Germany remain outside of dominant political imaginaries. In a political climate marked by rising xenophobia, national chauvinism, and anti-Muslim racism, the phrase Muslims of Turkish and Kurdish descent is meant to underscore a fundamental tension at the heart of public debates surrounding immigration, race, religion, and identity in Europe today. As other scholars have observed, and these are some of my favorite books that address these topics, such qualifiers are an effect of what many believe to be the incommensurability of categories such as German and Muslim, or Muslim and European. And these are just some books recently published in the past 5 years or so that address these issues within the European context, but I'm happy to speak more if students have particular questions about reading. Similar to what Lisa Lowe has indexed with reference to Asian Americans in the United States, Muslims in Germany are seen by many Germans as perpetual immigrants, eternal newcomers, or as the foreigner within. So given this context, I sought to better understand how Muslim communities in Germany managed and made sense of death and dying in a country where they did not always feel at home. And adopting an ethnographic approach, I conducted about 15 discontinuous months of field work in Berlin and Istanbul between 2013 and 2017, and that should give you a sense of the kind of timeline of the book production process too. This is a kind of a decade in the making. So in Germany, I studied the evolution of the Islamic funeral industry, working alongside Muslim undertakers at several Islamic funeral homes, helping, participating in every aspect of their day-to-day work. I assisted them in funeral ceremonies, helping to transport and bury deceased Muslims at a number of different cemeteries in Berlin. Together, we also prepared corpses for international repatriation and delivered them to Berlin area airports for shipment on cargo and commercial flights. During my research, I also visited dozens of cemeteries in Germany and in several other Western European countries to learn about patterns of posthumous memorialization. I photographed more than 1,000 tombstones in Germany, Belgium, Spain, Sweden, and the Netherlands to create a visual ethnographic archive of the physical landscapes of burial and commemoration, what I refer to in the book as Europe's Islamic deathscapes. I also conducted semi-structured interviews with bereaved families, government officials, religious leaders, medical practitioners, and representatives of Islamic funeral funds, all in an effort to better understand the role that end-of-life practices play in the negotiation of social, political, and cultural boundaries. Alongside these formal interviews, I had countless informal conversations with community members during visits to ethnic and cultural associations, youth centers, mosques, restaurants, and cafes, which ultimately helped shape the direction that my research questions took. In Turkey, meanwhile, I spent 3 months conducting field work in Istanbul to learn more about the receiving end of the repatriation process. I was able to interview municipal cemetery administrators and to accompany undertakers to the airport to pick up bodies that had been shipped from overseas. I also attended and observed several funeral ceremonies and visited nearly a dozen municipal cemeteries to better understand differences in funerary rituals and memorialization practices. And while I won't go into it right now, I'm happy to also address questions about positionality and strategies for conducting field work in the Q&A if anyone is kind of embarking on an ethnographic project or is interested in kind of methodological questions concerning ethnographic or qualitative research. So me as a Turkish American doing research in Europe with Turkish diasporas, there was a lot happening there. So in the time I have remaining, let me try to walk you through the book and the main arguments. So the first half of the book focuses on the legal, institutional, and economic aspects of death out of place, what might be understood as the material conditions of death, burial, and end-of-life care in migratory settings. So chapter 1 looks at the work of Islamic funeral funds in Europe, which provide logistical and financial support for the cross-border transportation of Muslim corpses. These institutions emerge in tandem with the aging of the first generation of Muslim immigrants in Western Europe in the 1990s and the growing need for culturally and religiously appropriate funerary services. So I focus on the two largest and most important funds in Europe whose combined membership is nearly 500,000 members in all of Europe. And these funds are administered by two long-standing Turkish Islamic civil society associations who, in addition to providing funerary services, offer a wide range of religious, educational, and cultural services, such as the organization of Hajj pilgrimages, Eid celebrations, as well as Quran courses, language training, and professional education. So drawing on interviews with fund administrators and close readings of primary sources such as promotional literature and membership contracts, I examined the strategies and practices through which these organizations institutionalize, incentivize, and justify posthumous repatriation for burial. And I argue that by incentivizing the cross-border repatriation, they affirm the symbolic connection between the dead body and the nation and help legitimize the idea that the dead belong in a particular place, engaging in a form of what I call necropatriotism. These are just two ads from some of the funds. And I should note that this fund, which is run by the Diyanet, this is connected to the Turkish Ministry of Religious Affairs. The one on the right is from a community called Milli Görüş. And just to give you a sense, if you don't read Turkish or German, what they are saying here in the kind of moralistic overtone. So this advertisement says, with more than 200,000 members, have you not yet become a member of DİTİB's funeral fund? Because if not, you should hurry up and do so, because death never announces when it's going to arrive. And so, kind of some language there that this one on the right says, we are on your most painful day, we are by your side. And it goes on to show here the kind of process, right? The kind of bureaucratic processes, taking care of paperwork, the flight, the religious duties, and so on. So it's kind of explaining this as a streamlined process. These funds, in essence, are offering, they don't call themselves like a life insurance fund. They really eschew that kind of language, but they are offering a kind of service that when a fund member dies, they take care of all of the logistical operations connected to end-of-life care, burial, repatriation. And so here is, just from the founding statement of one of the funeral funds, it says, established in 1992 to provide a lasting, practical, and secure solution to the serious problem faced by our people who, having spent a lifetime in gurbet, which is not an easy word to translate into English, maybe it's kind of a exile mixed with melancholic longing or something like this. I don't know if Alize is a better translation, but out of a longing for their homeland, desire to have their bodies repatriated to our country for burial. In a very short time, this fund has provided for the mutual support and solidarity desired among our citizens, and has been the object of great interest and respect. The kind of earlier historical predecessors that I try to link these to are the burial societies established by mutual aid organizations, fraternal organizations in the US, like the Oddfellows and so on. But they're a little different in their scope because the primary purpose is to repatriate the bodies outside of Western Europe. Many of these funds don't pay for burial plots in Europe, and that's an important consideration. It was difficult to find a lot of statistics on this. I asked a lot of the fund administrators, and they didn't want to share them with me, but before they took them, they used to publish them on the web, and they don't anymore. Before they took them off, I was able to find some numbers pertaining to the burial outcomes of fund members from over a decade ago, and this is just the DİTİB fund members in Germany. You can see a kind of overwhelming number are repatriated outside of Germany for burial. Second chapter, this is the kind of core ethnographic chapter of the book, focuses on Muslim undertakers, the bureaucracy of death, and the Islamic funeral industry in Germany. And as I mentioned before, my ethnographic research included participant observation with several Islamic funeral homes in Berlin. This is one of them, Ada Islamic funeral home in the neighborhood of Neukölln. During my field work, I attended, observed, and took part in all aspects of their work, from preparing corpses for burial to burying bodies locally. This is a cemetery in Berlin, and preparing them for international repatriation. So these photos are taken at the Berlin Schönefeld airport as they're loading the coffin into the cargo hold. And I should point out that in many Muslim majority countries, funerary services are part and parcel of the welfare state. Funerals are typically conducted within 24 hours of an individual's death. And so the establishment of a private market for Islamic funerals in Germany is really a novel consequence of migration. So I came to understand the work that the work of undertaking takes on political salience in multicultural societies when different ethnic and religious groups have divergent views on death and dying, end-of-life care, and the proper treatment of corpses. So in situations where there's some uncertainty about the funerary traditions and burial laws, undertakers themselves play a critical role in guiding families through the religious, political, and legal landscapes that structure transitions from life to death. Here's one of the undertakers that I work with in his office. So they served as political and cultural intermediaries between Muslim communities and the German state in two important ways. First, they helped socialize their customers to the norms and values underlying the German legal rational order and its associated expectations. So the bureaucracy of death functions not only as an institution that is particularly emblematic of such an order, but reflects a broader socio-cultural structure with associated attitudes, mannerisms, dispositions, and sensibilities. In other words, the bureaucracy of death reflects a particular way of being properly German or properly integrated. Second, Muslim undertakers offer lessons about Muslim citizens to the German state by countering derogatory stereotypes about Islam and Muslims in Germany. Through their daily encounters and conversations with civil servants and agents of the German bureaucracy, they seek to dispel widely held myths and negative perceptions about Islam and Muslims. When burying the dead and tending to the living, the Muslim undertakers of Berlin work to reconcile competing and sometimes conflicting sets of administrative and cultural norms surrounding death and burial. For example, as I mentioned, while Muslims believe that the deceased should be buried as soon as possible after death, usually within 24 hours, German laws require a mandatory 48-hour waiting period, which in practice can take much longer if there are concerns about the cause of death. Likewise, while Muslims believe that individuals should be buried without a coffin, many states in Germany mandate the use of one. So in reconciling these kind of issues and other issues, Muslim undertakers of Berlin preside not just over end-of-life decisions and their theological implications, but over pedagogical moments of political and socio-cultural integration in contemporary Germany. Their ability to navigate both the regulatory structures of the German bureaucracy and the cultural expectations of their customers is both a defining feature of their occupational identity and a principal source of their professional authority. So let me give you a few examples from my interviews to illustrate what I have in mind. So one undertaker, who I'll call Bülent, told me, with reference to the attitudes and expectations of his customer, "We live in a, quote, non-Muslim, gayrimüslim country. There are laws. We have to go to the government agencies. This isn't a village. When someone dies, you can't just bury them that afternoon. The government agencies in Germany are open in the morning and closed in the afternoon. Think about it. You have to go pick up the body from the hospital, take care of all the official procedures, and the whole system works by appointment. It's not a village. You can't just call the imam and say, let's just get this over with." He went on to say, "Our people have been living here for 50 years. They could live here for another 150 years and they wouldn't understand the system of the country they live in. They don't understand the German system, nor do they want to understand it. Whatever pre-existing mentality they brought with them from Anatolia, the village mentality, it's still there. So this is a Turkish immigrant who came to Germany himself from Anatolia, and this is kind of how he's making sense of his customers, right? So for Bülent and the other undertakers, the bureaucracy is an inescapable aspect of their day-to-day work. It's at once a source of frustration and the basis of their authority. Although they are impeded and annoyed by the endless amount of paperwork and the difficulty of coordinating across a myriad of different governmental agencies, they are committed to the logic and practice of the bureaucratic order. This is like they don't understand the system, right? Their ability to navigate the intricacies of the bureaucracy of death is intrinsic to their role as cultural mediators and is a central feature of their occupational identity and expertise. So mastery or know-how of the bureaucracy furnishes individuals with a certain type of cultural capital that can be used as a resource in the pursuit of economic gain. And to be fair, the bureaucracy of death in Germany is very complex. So Mehmet, another undertaker, described to me the steps leading up between a person's death and burial. And he says that in some municipalities, the Standesamt, the civil registration office, are closed on Wednesdays and Fridays. We can't do anything those days. And on Thursdays, they're only open in the afternoon after 2 p.m. So if you have a death on a Tuesday and you want to repatriate the body, the earliest it will go is the following Monday, because the Standesamt is closed on a Wednesday. On Thursday it opens at 2, but by the time I'm finished there, the consulate is closed. On Friday, the Standesamt is closed, and everything is closed over the weekend, so it has to wait until Monday. If someone dies on a Monday, we can usually ship the body the next day without all these problems, right? So here I'm reminded also of Elizabeth and Noora's work about how time becomes a kind of modality of disciplinary power, right? So what I find compelling in the undertaker's stories, though, is how they are personally imbricated in the reproduction of a bureaucratized vision of social and political life. So in mediating encounters between minority citizens and the state, they help translate and disseminate political norms, but also work to enforce them, to discipline. Right? So in this sense, the work of undertaking is not simply a matter of burying bodies. In their interactions with customers, the Muslim undertakers of Berlin preside over pedagogical moments of political and socio-cultural integration in Germany. So as I mentioned earlier, the mediating role played by the undertakers is multi-directional. Remember that they work not only with minority communities, but also with state officials. So in the course of their day-to-day tasks, they have numerous personal interactions with German bureaucrats at a number of different venues, and they also work hand in hand with various agencies and agents of the German state. So another dimension of their mediating work involves combating negative stereotypes about Muslims in Germany. By presenting themselves as responsible, professional, well-integrated, knowledgeable individuals, Muslim undertakers attempt to demystify popular assumptions and misconceptions about Islam and Muslims in Germany. And in some cases, they undertake the role of a spokesperson and pedagogue willingly. In other times, they find themselves in a position where they feel compelled to speak on behalf of others. So one undertaker, whom I'll call Ismail, explained it to me in the following terms. He says, quote, "I teach a lot of classes in hospitals and police stations about the things that people should pay attention to when there's a dying Muslim. Since 9/11, people in Germany get a little uneasy when they hear the word Muslim. I try to alleviate those fears in my classes. Germans are really afraid of Muslims," he continued, "and after those events in the US, they look even more afraid. If someone says something like Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, the Germans look around and say, what's going on? Is there a bomb somewhere? So in the courses I teach," he says, "I try to take away this fear." And so for Ismail, negative stereotypes about Muslims in Germany are pervasive, have only been heightened in the post-9/11 era. He sees a need to correct unfavorable ideas about Muslims by educating people who have regular contact with Muslims in their line of work. And so one technique that he employs is explicitly pedagogical. By visiting hospitals and speaking with staff members, his goal is to educate them about Islamic death rites and rituals so that they can provide proper end-of-life care. Another strategy involves his own appearance and self-presentation. So he says, most people who visit my funeral home expect to see a bearded man, a Hacı Hoca, which is like a Turkish slang for like an ostentatious religious figure. When they see me, they're surprised. They ask me, wait, you're a Muslim? Because they were expecting someone with a big beard. So he expresses a certain pleasure in this kind of misrecognition by not conforming to the expected image of a Muslim undertaker. He challenges preconceptions about what a Muslim should look like. So in embodying and presenting an alternative Islamic identity, he hopes to dispel some of the myths that circulate in the German public sphere. Now, as an undertaker, he doesn't represent any particular group or community, but he willingly embraces the role of a public figure with a political mission. And in challenging expectations about Muslims in Germany, he provides a type of corrective cultural mediation. So I'm happy to say more about the undertakers in the Q&A, but let me move to the second half of the book, which looks at the symbolic and cultural dimensions of death, dying, and burial in migratory contexts. And in these chapters, I'm particularly interested in processes of placemaking and identity construction, evident in the rituals and ceremonies accompanying acts of burial and memorialization. So the third chapter offers a visual ethnography of Islamic burial grounds in Europe and focuses on representations of religious, ethnic, and national identities on the tombstones of Muslim graves. This sign is from the entrance to the Islamic burial section in one of Berlin's cemeteries. There's now 3 cemeteries in the city that have ground reserved for Muslims. And this is the oldest one, 1988. And you can see the kind of multi-language signage in German, Turkish, and Arabic. And in this chapter, I try to illustrate the central role that cemeteries play in the construction of diasporic memory and collective identity by analyzing tombstones located in several Islamic burial grounds in Germany and in other European countries. So as I mentioned earlier, in spite of the long-term settlement of Muslims in Europe, Islamic cemeteries are still extremely rare. In Germany, less than 1% of the country's approximately 32,000 public burial grounds have dedicated spaces for Muslims. But though they are uncommon, these sites are suffused with deep cultural meaning. As places where the physical landscape is symbolically inscribed and resignified, Islamic burial grounds offer insight into the changing contours of political membership and identity in increasingly multicultural European societies. They are places where ethno-religious minorities assert their long-term presence. And in doing so, they help normalize symbols of national, religious, and linguistic diversity in contemporary Europe. So let me show you a few examples. Graves are marked as Islamic through the use of various religious epitaphs such as Ruhuna Fatiha or simply Fatiha, reference to the first chapter of the Quran and an injunction for passers-by to pray for the souls of the deceased. The act of writing Fatiha on a tombstone not only marks the individual deceased as a Muslim, but also situates her within the broader collective Islamic community by instigating communicative action between the deceased and other members of the Muslim community. So the Fatiha signals the existence of a Muslim identity while simultaneously entreating other Muslims to profess and perform their own Islamic identities and piety through ritualistic acts of prayer. By acknowledging the deceased as Muslim and by praying for the souls of all Muslims, the observant visitor to an Islamic cemetery reflexively produces the wider Islamic community through pious symbolic action. So perhaps it's unsurprising that Muslim graves would utilize religious language in memorializing an individual. The practice is common in other religious faiths too, such as Christian graves that invoke Jesus Christ or salvation. What was more surprising, to me at least, was the presence of national flags and tombstones in the shapes of mosques, which I'll come to in a moment. So in places where commemorative practices are more explicitly shaped by the state, like military cemeteries or memorials to soldier dead or to the tombs of unknown soldiers. The utilization of national flags on or near tombstones is perhaps a calculated strategy to bolster patriotic sentiment. It also serves as a reminder of the state's sovereignty, its power over life and death. But how might we interpret the fact that the flags marking Europe's Muslim dead are affixed not to the graves of soldiers and statesmen, but rather to the tombstones of ordinary civilians? These private acts of commemoration nationalize the dead and situate them within a particular political community. They can be read as symbols of real or aspirational patriotism. Who knows? But whether or not the individual in question actually harbored a strong patriotic sentiment is less important than the message conveyed by the existence of a flag on a tombstone which links the dead to a specific country. The flag is a recognizable visual marker that has the potential to reach a wider audience than an epitaph or inscription, particularly if the text of these is written in a language that is unintelligible to the observer. This was another trend that I saw, multilingual inscriptions or monolingual inscriptions in non-German languages. Flags, though, are powerful symbols of national belonging that communicate a range of emotional attachments to nation-states and political communities. In minority burial grounds in migratory settings, the flag of a foreign country sends a strong and potentially paradoxical message to visitors. Like the common practice of indicating a foreign birthplace, the flag's presence acknowledges histories of migration and signals membership in other political communities. Yet the graves are also a testament to the fact that repatriation was not pursued, right? These graves are in Germany. Finally, with the cemeteries, a particularly peculiar and innovative grave form that I observed in Islamic cemeteries across Europe was the mosque grave. Mosque graves transform the landscape of European cemeteries by imbuing them with new religious iconography. They are, I think, a stunning example of what art historian Christy Gruber has termed Islamic architecture on the move. But what sort of politics is present in the construction of mini-mosques in public cemeteries? As I read it, the use of Islamic architectural elements like the mosque grave is in part a response to the social and political challenges faced by Muslim communities across Europe. In recent decades, the visibility of Islamic symbols in the European public sphere, like the headscarf or actual mosques, has generated much political controversies. So efforts to build actual, brick and mortar mosques and sites of worship have been undermined by those who see the presence of Islamic buildings as a threat to the purportedly secular landscape of the European public sphere. The incorporation of religious architecture and design in the public space of the cemetery can be understood as one strategy through which Muslim communities across the continent express their religious faith and represents an innovative step towards the normalization of Islamic symbols in the European landscape. So just as Muslim tombstones may display features of syncretism and assimilation to dominant cultures, they also showcase the ways in which Islamic elements become subtly incorporated into an urban fabric. And rather than assuming that the expression of national, ethnic, or religious affiliation is simply evidence of cultural retention or communalism, right, like a kind of unwillingness to integrate, I think it's helpful to understand such gestures as evidence of the changing nature of European identity. Read in this light, expressions of Islam in places like Berlin, Brussels, or Stockholm are not instantiations of an outside, extraneous, or foreign culture. They are reflections of an evolving and dynamic multicultural and multi-confessional society. While mosques and minarets might currently seem out of place in the cemetery or in the city, their proliferation has the potential to neutralize their effect. In the future, they might be just as unremarkable as the crosses and church towers that are an integral part of Europe's urban landscape. By burying their dead in Germany and elsewhere in Europe, ethnic and religious minorities claim European soils as their own. And though their tombstones might display markers of authority, their corpses Though their tombstones might display markers of alterity, their corpses attest to the fact that they are here to stay. So having taken you, and this is the last bit of the lecture, having taken you on a brief tour of Europe's Islamic deathscapes, let me turn now to the fourth and final section of my book, which investigates the different factors that influence family decisions about where to bury their loved ones and the significance that they might ascribe to the location of burial. In explaining their own preferences and reflecting on the decisions of others, my interview partners emphasize the role of the family, the significance of territory and soil, and one's own structural position within German society as the most important factors influencing burial outcomes. These factors lent credence to my interviewees' attachments to Turkey or to Germany and were central in their narratives about the significance of life, death, and burial in the context of migration. So let me share with you a few quotes from my interviews to show you what I have in mind here. And here I'm especially interested in the kind of ways that these families are narrating their decisions, the kind of discourses, right? So corporeal assertions of belonging deploy the body as an anchor. In some cases, the dead are anchored by their children. So one elderly woman whom I interviewed in a retirement home told me that when I die, I want to be buried here. My children are here. A man that I interviewed at a Kurdish cultural center expressed concern that no one would visit or honor his memory by visiting his grave if he were repatriated for burial. So he said, the villages are empty. If you're buried in Germany, someone can at least visit you every week or on the holidays. They can leave some flowers on your grave, or at the very least, come and look at it. But just as future generations anchor the dead can anchor future generations. So some of my respondents thought that repatriation was actually preferable to local burial because it would encourage the children and the grandchildren of the deceased to maintain some kind of emotional connection to their ancestral soils. So a retired nurse who came to Germany as a young child and said that her husband wants to be buried in his homeland so our children can visit him and maintain their ties to Turkey. Although she herself wanted to be buried in Germany, she wondered whether it would be better to be buried alongside her husband in Turkey for the sake of their children. When you become a mother or a father, she told me with a smile, you think of your children even after death. Two Alevi religious leaders that I spoke to also emphasized the importance of maintaining intergenerational connections to ancestral lands through the practice of repatriation for burial. So during our lengthy conversation, they stressed the importance of land, soil, and historical memory. Our graves are our genealogical records, one of them said. I know my great-great-grandfather's grave. For me, this is history. I don't have to ask anyone. I can go there and see 200, 250 years of history. My child sees this too, and for him, the grave is a reference point. For us Alevis, this is very important. So the village cemeteries in Turkey thus served as an important referent for Alevis in the diaspora, offering material proof of their history and genealogy. The religious leaders that I spoke to supported repatriation precisely because it helped preserve historical memory and genealogical continuity in a migratory context. And while different ideas about family and communal continuity result in different burial outcomes, among all of my interview partners, there was a recognition that the dead anchor the living by conferring historical depth and significance to particular places. So when articulating why they thought it was important to maintain these ties and connections, some of my interview partners invoked the centrality of the physical landscape. The mountains, the soil, the air, the water are completely different. You even miss the stones. A Turkish woman in her 50s who had emigrated to Berlin as a child told me in justifying her decision to be repatriated for burial. Another interviewee, an elderly Kurdish man, recounted that, quote, the soil is honor and wealth. It means everything. In describing why he wanted to be buried in his familial village, he reasoned that, quote, I was born in that soil and I will return to it. That's my own view at least. That's where I was born. Sometimes my wife will tell me, let's get buried here in Germany, if that's what our kids want. But I say, forget about it. bring us back to the homeland. When I die, I want to be brought back to the homeland so that when I rot, when I'm eaten, it's the bugs and my ants from my village that eat me. That's what I always say. Some of my respondents viewed the decision to be buried in Germany as a coming to terms with the decades-long process of settlement and integration. So one of my informants, who's a Kurdish man in his mid-40s, who organizes funerals for the Kurdish community in Berlin and who's been living in Germany for more than 15 years, told me with reference to the third generation that, quote, they are here for good. God forbid, but when they die, they are buried here. This proves that they are here to stay. They aren't immigrants. They are permanent members of this society. He noted that in an earlier era, only stillborn babies were buried in Germany, but that increasingly adults were buried here too. For people who live here, he observed, this place is a part of them. This is a reality. Germany has become like a homeland. And used the word vatan in Turkish, a kind of a strong word for homeland. We feel freer here. We can speak more freely here. But others felt differently. One of my interview partners, who was a successful entrepreneur in his early 40s, who owns and operates a series of restaurants in Berlin, told me that our soil is there in Turkey. I want to be buried there too. I grew up here in Germany, but that is our soil. We live here, we do everything here, but this place never fully accepted us, and it never fully will. It's impossible, really impossible. That's why we'll always remain foreigners. So what's the point of being buried in a foreign country? So here the link between social exclusion and the desire for posthumous repatriation is made explicit, stating that it's impossible for him to be fully accepted in German society. He seeks refuge in a soil over which he claims ownership. In this account, social death generates a longing for belonging, which can only be achieved after biological death and return to natal soils for burial. Another interview partner, a retired Turkish factory worker in his mid-60s, put it even more bluntly. Let me be honest, he said, I've been scorned in Germany, I've been despised and disparaged. That's why I want to be buried where I was born. I have a homeland. Why should I be buried here? Whenever something happens in Germany, they always blame the Turks. My grave should be in Turkey. I'm determined. If my family wants to join me, fine. If not, it doesn't matter. I was always Auslander. I was always a foreigner. I don't want to be Auslander in my grave. So both these statements exemplify the potential disconnect that exists between formal legal membership through citizenship, right, and a sense of belonging in a political community. Experiences with racism, discrimination, or xenophobia generate feelings of perpetual foreignness, a stigma which follows individuals to the grave. In such contexts, repatriation might be read as an act of defiance that signals the rejection of a political community that excludes. But on the other hand, the posthumous homecoming that is imagined in these accounts belies the profound disillusionment that can characterize return journeys, a disillusionment that grows in proportion to the gulf between nostalgia and reality. So in either case, the narratives illustrate how membership and belonging to political and national communities is structured and made meaningful through end-of-life rituals and post-mortem practices. So just to conclude, as I hope I've shown you a little bit today, that while death is undoubtedly a universally shared experience, it poses distinct challenges for minoritized communities in migratory settings. Death out of place foregrounds questions that are central to the intergenerational experience of migration. Who am I and where do I belong? For members of the Muslim minority communities, who are the interlocutors of my book, the complex web of interests, institutions, and emotions that accompany the rupture of death out of place through the funeral industry and its engagement with state bureaucracy, the choice between repatriation or local burial, and the symbolic act of commemoration through a grave marker exemplifies how national identity in a transnational world is ambiguously resolved even in death, neither obviously here nor there. So thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Amazing. So I I have a ton of questions. I'm not going to ask all of them. I'm going to ask one that's kind of a two-part question, and then I'll open it up and hear from all of you. And so the first one is, the line of questioning is kind of about methods and personal, like how you got in. How did you become Dr. Death, right? Like there's once I started reading your work, I realized actually these questions align, they emerge in so many different places, but we really don't pay attention to them. There isn't this literature around death and burials when it comes to migration. So how did you get the idea? And then relatedly, I think, especially as you're talking about your fieldwork, when we think about training and methods, we think maybe before you do your dissertation fieldwork, you're going to take some language courses, you're going to learn some of these other kinds of how to do archival research. How did you mentally prepare yourself for being surrounded by death? You were in close quarters. This was actual, proper ethnographic study. And I guess how did you prepare? What was challenging? What was exciting or surprising about that? How did you become Dr. Death?
Being in Berlin helped with the preparation for the mental. Okay, great questions. Well, I came to this topic. This was the base of my dissertation, which then I sort of revised for the book, but I was really interested in transnational migration. I had the language skills that I knew I was going to do something with the Turkish diasporas in Europe. I'd written an undergraduate thesis on France and questions around Islam and laicite and secularism. So I wanted to go to a new place. I wanted to learn about a new country. Berlin is the home to one of the largest Turkish diasporas in the world. And Germany is the country that has the largest number of Turks outside of Turkey. So this was a kind of a natural destination. And I was trying to think of, what am I going to write about? Something about, migration, diaspora, identity, belonging, citizenship, inclusion, exclusion. I mean, all these topics, borders, so on, right? Homemaking. And I didn't know what my angle was going to be on this. At first, I thought maybe I'd write about tracing ethnic commodities in the kind of Apadurai way, right? And, going to grocery stores and thinking about the political economy of ethnic commodities. Then I thought about newspapers and media. And then, I had this idea maybe that there's something in funeral homes, right? I don't know exactly how it came to me, but there was a movie that I saw called Almanya, which is a really cheesy rom-com film made by two Turkish-German sisters. It's called Almanya, Welcome to Germany. And the premise in the movie, it's 3 generations of a Turkish family. The father is like from the original Gastarbeiter, the guest workers. And one day he announces to his family that I've bought some land in Turkey and we're all going on this big family vacation, and, kind of chaos and hilarity ensues, right? But without giving away too much of the plot, well, I am going to give it away. The father dies when he's in Turkey, the grandfather, and they try to bury him, but the local authorities won't because he's become a German citizen on the insistence of his wife, and he never wanted to do it, and she insisted, and all of a sudden now he can't be buried in the village, which is not true, by the way, but this is just a little plot twist. So I got to thinking a little bit about, burial, membership, so on. I started looking into this. If any of you have seen the films by Fatih Akın, who's a Turkish-German director, Head On is the most famous one, Gegendivan. There's always a kind of a corpse that gets shipped across a border. I started, thinking about this, and there's a great novel called E5 in Turkish, written by a Turkish-German author who is a guest, moved to Germany as a guest worker, where the plot involves smuggling a body of a dead relative who overstayed their visa in like a television box by car from Germany to Turkey. So there was all these kind of literary and filmic references that got me thinking a little bit about this. And once I started getting into the topic and did my preliminary field work, I realized that this was really just like a super provocative window into understanding the intergenerational experience of migration. I'm a second generation immigrant, first generation American, so questions about, home and belonging, it's just, nonstop at the dinner table my whole life. Living back and forth between two countries, you learn to be both an insider to one culture, but also an outsider. You have a perspective that's not quite comfortable, I would say. And I know you've moved around a lot too, so it gives you a perspective to understanding these different societies in a different way than if you were native, I guess. And so I started digging deeper, and I realized that through something we don't really like to think about. I mean, who wants to think about death all the time? And I guess I did for a while, but
10 years.
For 10 years. But it actually, all of these conversations and these questions that are talked about all the time and always deferred. What are we going to do when we retire? Where are we going to move to? What's, all of these crystallize in the moment of death. To use a political science term, it's a critical juncture where, a decision has to be made about what happens to the body. And all these conversations and questions that were deferred or, just kicked down the road, all of a sudden you have to make this decision that has enormous symbolic weight. And in trying to understand how people navigate in a very difficult moment, painful moment in their lives, right? This simple act of burial is not so simple once you start digging into it. And then I came to understand there's a whole bureaucratic apparatus, there's a whole commercial aspect of it. There's these funeral funds, right? There's a whole web of actors, local, domestic, a whole web of interests who have a particular stake in what happens to these bodies, right? So, the Turkish government funds repatriation because it helps fulfill a certain kind of a myth of return, right? I've been, the idea that you're in Germany for 50 years, your adult life, you're working, but when you die, you're coming back to the homeland, right? Like in the embrace of the homeland. So that's what I mean by the necropatriotism bit too. The dead bodies, the burial of dead bodies in particular, place soils, right, gives extra significance to those soils. It can nationalize them in certain ways. It can, just think about the veneration that American tourists who visit Normandy show, right? In these because it's a little part of the U.S. in France. So, this was the kind of inroad, and this is how I just kept unraveling the knot, I guess, and realizing how much was there in that. In this universal phenomenon, right, of death. And it's true, it's not something that there was a lot of literature about, so that's why the book kind of draws on all sorts of different literatures, films, other disciplines. So it is an interdisciplinary work, and I find that for me that's helpful for my own thinking, is to pull pieces from all sorts of places and put together some kind of a pastiche, because real life is more messy than academic disciplines. So it's good to help get cues from where we can. So I'll stop there, and maybe I'll pause for the methodological question.
Yeah, we'll come back to it.
Talk so much.
Jeremy, Professor Menchik.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's such a wonderful project. It's so fertile. Every time I hear you, the second time I've gotten to hear you present your work, and every time I want to go on field trips with you. I want to go to Indonesia, to the tombs of the Wali Songo, to the Saints of Java, which are these sites of pilgrimage and massive contestation between modernists and traditionalist Muslims over who should go there, whether you should go there, what you should do while you're there, how you should pray while you're there, the kind of education you're getting, and then the kind of imaginary that you're creating through those, those places. So it's such a fertile topic. There's two aspects of death and the politics of death that you didn't touch on that I kind of want to push you on a little bit.
Okay.
One is these are moments where you're, and I love to use all this language, how you're grounded, right, and it's fertile soil, but it's also transcendence, right? And there's a whole aspect of transcendence that you're not kind of teasing out in this talk. I love funerals, not because I celebrate death or anything, but because they provide an opportunity for celebrating the individual and the community, and thinking about one's life outside of oneself and what you leave behind, and the soul or the spirit of a person that remains afterwards. And like what I tried to do in that moment is like touch everyone a little bit, so they thought about, oh, what's gonna happen when I die, right? Like those are moments of transcendence where we get beyond thinking about like IKEA, capitalism, all that shit, right? You think about something larger than oneself, and how does that factor in to what you saw? And then second, you talked about the intergenerational aspects of death, which I think is really potent, but you did it in a way that was about patriotism and nationalism. I've been thinking so much in the past 3 months about my great-grandfather, Louis Swedlow, who walked out of Russia in 1905 because he didn't want to be conscripted in the Russian army, didn't want to be part of the counter-revolutionary movement. And he's buried in a graveyard in Queens, and he's buried in a Workers' Circle cemetery. And Workers' Circle is a communist Jewish organization that I'm now a member of, and I'm incredibly proud of, because it's not a Jewish, it's not a Zionist organization. It's a Jewish organization, but it's not a Zionist organization. That's like incredibly important to me right now. So I can imagine, and I want to make a pilgrimage to his grave because of the world as it is now, and that wasn't meaningful to me 5 years ago, 20 years ago, right? Maybe I wanted to visit. So where are those generational differences that are not just about patriotism and nationalism, but to me, Louis Swedlow's grave is a way to commemorate internationalism and to transcend that divide that I see, that I want no part of, and he did in a way, right? Although, who knows, because I haven't had it.
Yeah, great. Thank you, and thank you for sharing those stories, Jeremy. I mean, it's like every good Marxist makes a pilgrimage to Highgate and on the visit to London, and poses with Marx's tomb, and you've got Eric Hobsbawm just across the way there now. So there's a kind of, I thought about that Hobsbawm really wanted to be buried right there, and I'm thinking about the kind of shrine effect that Marx's graves has, and the kind of proximity of the other tombs to it being a kind of a marker of one's allegiance or fidelity to the cause in a way. I think I'd love to go see this cemetery in Queens, and I think you're pointing out an important aspect of the, and maybe this links to the transcendence question too. I'm going to try to link these two together, about how cemeteries are places where it's not just kind of intergenerational relationships, but it's sites where like the living connect with the transcendent, with the living connect with the dead, right? When you go there for a visit, people engage in all kinds of idiosyncratic practices beyond maybe just praying for the soul of the deceased, which is obviously an important consideration for people visiting lost ones, right? But having conversations, maybe I went to Jim Morrison's grave in Paris when I was in my 20s, and people are just there drinking or whatever. There's all kinds of acts that people do in cemeteries in order to instantiate or to sort of perform, bring into being some vision of a kind of a community, whether it be in the case of the workers, right, the kind of a more internationalist orientation, in the case of Jim Morrison, the Dead Poets, or whoever you want to affiliate yourself with there. But there's a kind of a bond that continues after death through these visits, through these conversations. And the conversations are one-sided because they're not going to speak back to you, right? But I think in that moment, it's really like, and you were mentioning earlier, IKEA, and it's a moment of like sort of decentering and calmness that you have in the quiet of the cemetery that's meditative and reflective. And it's a way of sort of processing your thoughts and your connections and your relations and your relationships through this silent act of dialogue with the ancestors, right? And this is why, Enseng Ho has this great book called The Graves of Tarim, where he writes about, this kind of semiotic potential of the tombstone which invokes or kind of entices communicative acts between the living and the dead, right? Just by reading the text on the tombstone, you're already pronouncing the name, you're already even though you may not know the individual, you're just kind of bringing them to life in a way by enunciating their name, and just thinking about these relations between the living and the dead and the transcendent. I mean, the cities of ancient Rome used to be lined with tombstones, so any visitor to an ancient Roman city would pass the city of the dead before they got to the city center. And there was this grave convention, via sistare, welcome visitor, you who are living. Once I too was like you, young and beautiful and hardworking, and one day you too shall be like me, right? And there was this kind of communicative function between the living and the dead that is both a kind of a reminder of mortality, right, and a kind of an invitation to reflect on the liminality or ephemerality or the transcendence of the material world, right? But it's also a kind of a sort of a community building thing. I mean, I do believe that it's a way of strengthening bonds and performing acts of solidarity or acts of community with the dead. And you can go to, and this is what I would go hang out in the cemeteries, and I observe how people are relating to the dead, right? Sometimes they would pull out their cell phone and play like a prayer, right, with their phones to, so that the dead could hear the ezan sort of thing, right? Sometimes they would bring some, pictures and put them down, some flowers. They tell the dead what's happening in their lives, right? I mean, I didn't get close enough that I was listening to the eavesdropping, but I think there is that bond between the material world and the, transcendent world. And through these rituals of grave visits and the kind of practices that one does in there, it's a way to basically experience time on a different plane, right? Because you are there in the present, looking at the past, thinking about the future, all in this one kind of really pregnant moment of communication. That's one way, but maybe you start hearing answers if you stay long enough, So, yeah.
Great. I see two hands from our faculty. Our student, I see a student, two hands here. Okay, so maybe I'll collect. Yes. Collect, and please introduce yourself, Renee.
Hi, I'm Ayushi. I am a journalism major. And my question is that, so you talked to a lot of people when you went to Berlin and everything. So while talking to them, were you able to figure out why these people never decided to move back to where they came from, especially after experiencing such social exclusion?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why people stay put after immigration, and part of it, one reason is that they have families and they start establishing roots, right? One reason is that the conditions in the home country may have changed or deteriorated, gotten worse. It's harder for them to go back, especially if they are fleeing persecution or if they're part of a persecuted group, right? If they're asylum seekers, right? What ends up happening often, or I don't want to generalize, but people do maintain these transnational connections, right? So they'll go in the summer for the summer vacation, and they'll be kind of consuming the media from the home country, or they're reading the newspapers from the home country. Their diet doesn't change. Maybe they're still eating feta cheese and olives for breakfast and not eating schnitzel or whatever. I don't know what the Germans eat for breakfast, but muesli, they eat muesli and yogurt. In all these different ways, people through cultural practices reproduce some version of where they came from, right? And the decision to go back for good, people do that too. But then sometimes, they're like, well, the health system isn't as good as it was in Germany, and I need to go, go back so that I can seek medical care. Or wait a second, I got used to, this nice functional railway system that I can get from place to place, and maybe things aren't working as well here in my home country. Or they go back and all of a sudden their friends are saying, oh, you've changed. You're not really what you know. You've become too German now, right? And there's a specific word in Turkish that's a derogatory word for like a Turk who's become too Germanized, right? And so they're in this weird limbo where, well, in Germany they feel excluded because they're Muslims, they're darker skin, they have foreign-sounding name, they go back to Turkey and all their friends are like, oh, like you've become so German, and so you get caught in this limbo. And I don't want to generalize from, there's an infinite number of experiences that people might have with this, but that's what I was trying to get at with, this kind of disillusionment that could happen in these return migrations, which are always maybe imagined as being this triumphant, Homeric, I'm coming home after this long odyssey, and everyone's going to embrace me with open arms. But the more nostalgic you are about the homeland, right? And I think about my mom a lot when I'm saying this. The more nostalgic you are about what you left behind, the harder it is when you go back and you realize that the country has changed too, right? But you've been outside of that change, so now you don't even maybe recognize the things that you did. So it's really hard, I think. Yeah.
Directly on that, just when we talk about immigration, we usually think about it as a one-way thing.
Yeah.
And the reality is, in the U.S., in particular, we're bad about this.
Yeah.
The reality is half of Italians went back to,
Yeah.
they came here to work, and then they went back for, they retired, or they came here for a few years and went back. And it's really very common.
Yeah.
I mean, we have the Irish who kind of couldn't go back because of economic reasons, but it's not uncommon for people to go back
Sure.
at all. And I'm curious how many actually do go back and at what point. But then the other thing that's tied to that is, does the reason for their departure matter? So in particular, if you're talking about Kurds,
Sure.
I can imagine they might have a different
Sure.
vision of Turkey. And yes, they might ideally want to go back sometime, but maybe not to the Turkey as it is today.
Right.
And so if you have less economic and more political or identity-based reasons for leaving, I wonder if that kind of affects your desire to go back while you're still alive or after you pass.
Absolutely. I'll start with the Kurdish question first. The quote that I had up there, I didn't mention this, by the Kurdish guy, who said, I'm going to go back because it's important. I have my soil, I have my land. This is my home. It's important. This guy was a political asylum seeker in Germany who was involved in kind of separatist politics and fled Turkey basically because he was being targeted by the government as a separatist. And in spite of his kind of fraught history and the danger of him going back and facing arrest, he was very clear on one thing, and he said, this isn't some kind of like I want to go back to be buried there because this is the Kurdish homeland. And for him it was this kind of aspirational, almost this kind of patriotism for some nation, some state form that is yet to come into being. And by sending the body back, this would just be one small piece of that larger puzzle of laying claim on the land for Kurdish political interests. Of course, it's it's so much of it is based on the individual circumstances. As you rightly point out, for some people that return is fraught and difficult and challenging and impossible in some ways, especially if they have left for political reasons. But for those that did return, I mean, the origin of Turkish migration to Germany is part of the big wave of the guest worker programs in Germany that started in 1955. Turkey joined that program in '61, but the first two waves were, primarily Italian and Greek guest workers, and a lot of those workers, when the program ended in around 1973 after the oil crisis. A lot of those Italian workers and some of the Southern European workers who had come from Spain or Portugal, they did actually go back to those countries and stop being guest workers in Germany. Most of the Turks stayed and in fact relied on sort of legal mechanisms to bring their spouses and children to live with them through family reunification processes. So over the course of a few years, the Turkish community became the kind of largest minority among the different minority populations, and something like 4 million people of Turkish heritage in Germany today. So some of the other groups went back, and I think part of this could be explained by, these countries are joining the European Economic Community. They have greater, mobility rights owing to their citizenship and so on. But for the majority of the, and I wish I had some sort of numbers to share, but my understanding is that vast majority end up staying after the guest worker program is terminated, for fear that if they go back, maybe they'll never have another channel to return. This comes up later too with citizenship. I mean, until the early 2000s, Germany, the citizenship laws prohibited dual nationality. Turks in particular were, so there were some exceptions to the dual nationality rule, but you could not be both a Turkish and a German citizen. I think those laws have loosened in recent years, but for many people making that choice, they chose to maintain their German citizenship because it was an instrumental choice for them at that point. It gave them greater mobility. And that was an effort, I think, to, again, try to break some of the loyalties or allegiance, or this idea that if you're a dual national, you're always somehow suspect, right? Mm-hmm. Because whose side are you on, right? In those ways, I think it's, come up in kind of policy realm too.
Mm-hmm. I know we have at least 3 questions. Okay. Maybe we
I'll
can.
Be briefer. I'm sorry.
Maybe I can collect all 3 and then.
Sure.
All right, go ahead, please, and introduce yourself.
My name is Sam. I'm a policy minor, and thank you, Professor Balkan, for this very informative presentation. Before I ask a question, I want to make a comment. Okay. I think minorities' inconvenience and struggles are really often ignored and undermined, in general. I think German authorities really they don't really care about the Muslim burial culture and stuff. I think it's very sad to see. And my question is, so my perception from the interview quotes that you have provided is, a lot of Turkish living in Germany, they don't want local burials because they don't feel like they're fully accepted into German culture or the community. However, on the other hand, there's also a large number of Turkish immigrants in the U.S. Compared to the Turkish in Germany, I feel like Turkish immigrants in the U.S. are in general more accepted. And as a tourist, I've been to I've been to Germany and also Turkey. Mm-hmm. I definitely feel more welcomed in Turkey, even as a tourist. So have you done research on American Turkish's opinion on local burial or repatriation?
Okay.
Great, thank you. Welcome to Professor Schilde.
I'm Kaya Schilde. I'm a professor at Pardee School. And I have so many anecdotal things I wanted to say to you, and good thing we're having dinner, because I also was having the same thought as Jeremy briefly, having one of the wildest days of my life. I just had no idea about this whole world of death and everything. I knew about death, but I didn't know about particular practices around death. Was the day I went to my husband, then boyfriend's grandmother's funeral. Maybe the same cemetery in between 4 freeways in Queens. There are these Jewish worker organization cemeteries, but what's fascinating about them, it's Jeremy picked up on one aspect of it, that it was ideological, in terms of workers, but what I found the most fascinating was it was tied to fraternal organizations in towns, in what is now Ukraine, in Galicia. And so I was fascinated by the perpetuation through time. To somebody who lived in New York City and had no connection to a town in Galicia, how they're buried in a place that is labeled of a workman's circle from Galicia, from a town, a village, you know, in Galicia. And so if I were a sociologist, I would have run with it, right? But I just was astounded, you know, and it was like marked, I should Google that, you know, or something in my head, or read a book about it. But my question then relates to actually kind of what Tim was saying. I'm fascinated about the comparative aspect of this. I know this is ethnography and it's rich and deep, but I would like to push you, you know, on the variation here, you know, especially in terms of the practices of those who choose to marry in Europe. Is it because they have to? Is it because, and also variation inside Europe? Where do you think the variation comes from? Is it in the host countries and their exclusionary practices, or is it in patterns of exclusion from the home countries?
And then last question from Professor Coleman.
Thank you. I had many questions, and some of which you've answered, but I was kind of wondering if you could just give us a little bit of backstory. Like, it slipped into your talk that you're talking about flights. But obviously there's a time when flights weren't a thing, and I'm just wondering if you can contextualize this a little bit and tell us like a bit about the history of the practice of repatriating bodies.
Sure.
Because migration is older than airplanes.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
That's a great question.
I'll go back.
And
forward.
one
more,
last
okay.
one, so you have to keep all of them.
Okay.
Sorry, I was gonna hold off until dinner, but I'm just very briefly, sort of maybe joining with Kaya as well. Like, I wonder also if there are different kinds of necro-patriotisms at stake. Especially, I mean, we talked about this a little bit, but especially when we think about, for example, you know, Kurdish people being repatriated or not, or Alevi people, like that homeland or home, or even the land, the soil, the territory can mean very different things than, you know, somebody who chooses to have Turkish flags on their tombstone, for example. So I wonder if we can pluralize that a little bit.
Sure. Yes. The answer is yes to that question, and I'll say more about that. I want to be mindful. We just have
Yeah, we have like a few more minutes and 4 questions.
Okay, let me try to go. I mean, there I'm kind of interested in the symbolic acts of repatriation, the kind of meaning making and the aspirational patriotism or nationalism. The fact of, you know, I do see a strong link between claims of ownership over soil and the kind of being able to show the genealogy of your ancestors that are buried in this soil. And I think Vico writes about how this is like how property rights are established in you know, back in the day with the graves. You know, he says the giants would point to the graves of their forefathers and say, this land is mine. So I think there is a kind of a symbolic act of ownership claiming by repatriation, even when that nation state form is elusive or future-oriented or yet to be born. This is just kind of one mode of which to claim, to lay claim on the land. On the kind of, I'll just say on the history of kind of repatriation, I mean, I read accounts of, you know, the practice of embalming is invented during the Civil War, basically, and so some of the, you know, I didn't really trace much further back in time, but you know, one of the earliest uses of embalming was to treat soldiers who had died on the battlefield during the Civil War, and there was this cottage industry that grew around bringing bodies from the south to the north and north to the south. And I think this was achieved through railway. You know, I think that was before the flights. I think, you know, I don't have accounts of, you know, bodies being sent by ship or something like this, but I haven't really, that's something I should know a little bit more about, but yes.
It feels like something the Romans must have known how to do. I don't know.
But there is, you know, coming to the question about variation, right? Like, so the Brits buried their dead where they lay, and, you know, the whole phrase, there's a piece of the British Empire, you know, from, how does it go?
It's the sun.
For the sun never sets on the British Empire. There's a little piece of England everywhere. Then they could legitimate that by pointing to these kind of war commission cemeteries that, you know, the Brits would establish when their soldiers abroad were dead. They kept them there. The U.S. military spends a huge sum of money to repatriate soldier dead. The U.S. doesn't bury the dead. Ever since World War II, there's been a policy of concomitant return, so that soldiers killed in action will always be brought back. And you have the images of the Dover Air Force Base with the flag-draped coffins. And there's a huge amount of money that is spent on recovering and retrieving human remains in Vietnam and in other places. Sarah Wagner has a great book about this. So there's some variation at the level of kind of states that want to bring their dead, those that leave them, that I think one could theorize about different notions about empire or, you know, where the sort of the boundedness of territories. Variation among the minority populations in different Western European contexts. I mean, I think there's both a supply side and a demand side answer to this. You know, the availability of cemetery space that is appropriate for Muslim burials, very limited in all throughout Western Europe, right? And so sometimes families who wish to bury in an Islamic burial section just don't have the ability to do so because there are no cemeteries with spaces designated for Muslims. And in Europe, most of the countries that I'm aware that I have like looked into, cemeteries are all municipally owned and operated. They're all public. The majority of cemeteries are government run. It's not like a private cemetery like in the US. The funeral industry is not as nearly as privatized. And so it is a public policy issue, and I think this is one that we're going to be, I think, you know, European Muslims are going to be pressing to sort of create more burial spaces in Europe. A lot of these articles that came out during the pandemic were speaking exactly to this shortage and what it meant for, you know, long-term integration and settlement of these communities and the recognition that they're a part of the national fabric. But so, you know, there's that institutional side of it. And then on the sort of personal, familial level, I mean, there's various factors. You know, in some cases, what I was trying to show was the, you know, family ties or ideas about soil or social inclusion or exclusion. I've done some work with a co-author who worked with North African communities in France. Her interviews were showing similar patterns, right? But I think one interesting finding that I didn't mention during the talk was that, you know, I mentioned that there are certain laws that, you know, hinder the ability of an Islamic burial, like without a coffin or within a, you know, quick time after death. In my interviews, I often found that people were willing to suspend religious dictates if they felt that the body was going to be buried in the proper place. So even if it took a week to repatriate, they wouldn't say, oh, but we had to do it within 24 hours, because they were reassured by the idea that it was being returned to the proper soil, right? So in some ways, the religious dictates may seem rigid, but in practice, they may become more flexible. So this is another sort of area of variation that may challenge the notion that, you know, just the availability of cemeteries is one of the driving factors. But I found that it was difficult to make concrete statements about this because oftentimes, you know, I kind of separate these kind of heuristically, but there was often overlap and conflict and contradiction as people narrativized their accounts of why and what was happening. But if I did do a kind of a larger study, I would look at both, I guess, supply side and demand side factors and see what's happening there. And amongst different communities, are Muslims more likely than other minorities and so on. And finally, the question about the U.S., there is a Turkish community in the U.S. It's much more diffuse. Actually, the kind of Turkish diasporic hub in the Northeast is in Paterson, New Jersey. If you're curious, you can go there to get some good Turkish food. I haven't done much research on Turks in the U.S., but I do know that, you know, in Brooklyn there's a Turkish funeral home that specializes in repatriations and so on. This might be kind of a future exploration, but I might find a different topic for the next one. So thank you all very much. Yeah,
Thank you.